exactly 8:42 a.m., Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse in South Carolina. The morning sun was already casting long, warm shadows across the pavement as he took a deep breath behind the wheel. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his world ran on structure and punctuality, but today, life had other plans. This morning wasn't supposed to be complicated. Just a routine matter, correcting a mistake in a property tax assessment on the house his grandmother had left him. The city had suddenly increased the taxes without explanation, and Kendrick had spent weeks pulling together documents to prove it was an error. But to him, this wasn't just real estate. That house was where he learned right from wrong, under his grandmother's firm but loving guidance. It was personal. Wearing a sharp navy suit and crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every inch the experienced attorney, even though the start of his day had been chaotic. An urgent call about a human trafficking case had thrown off his schedule. The defense had filed a last-minute motion, and Kendrick had to respond before running out the door. Now, as he walked briskly toward the courthouse, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant, the judge in Greenville's got a reputation. Tough on anyone running late. Be careful. He tucked the phone away, not too worried. He came armed with facts and proof. Still, the warning stayed with him. Inside, the courthouse felt like a different world from the federal courts he was used to. Beige walls, worn-out seats, and that familiar smell of stale coffee and paperwork filled the air. But the place was alive, people coming and going with nervous eyes and stacks of paperwork over fines and small claims. 8:50 a.m. He checked his watch, barely 10 minutes to find the right room. He hurried down a narrow hallway, past hushed conversations and scuffed floors, until he reached room 204. Judge Charles Whitman, the brass plate read. Kendrick fixed his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling up. He took a seat near the back, opened his folder, and started reviewing his case. Just then, the door opened. Judge Whitman entered, a tall man with silver hair and ice-blue eyes. He didn't say a word, but the entire room snapped to attention. All rise, the bailiff called, and everyone stood. Kendrick straightened his back, locking in his focus. The judge began calling cases with the speed and precision of a machine. One man slipped in late. Then a young woman in jeans. Neither got so much as a glance from the bench. Kendrick noticed, but stayed focused. Then, at 9:15 sharp, his name echoed through the courtroom. He stood, gathered his papers, and approached the podium, calm on the outside despite the delay. But as he stepped forward, the judge looked up, and everything changed. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman said, his voice slicing through the quiet. "Do you believe the court's time is less important than your own?" Kendrick raised his hand slightly, palms open. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was handling urgent federal matters." "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," the judge snapped, not even letting him finish. "This court runs on order and respect. If you can't grasp that, maybe you need to rethink your role." It was something many in the room had probably witnessed before, but this time, Kendrick Robinson wasn't going to let it slide. He glanced at the other late arrivals. Not one of them had been called out. No fine. No lecture. Nothing. The double standard was clear as day. Back in his seat, Kendrick opened his folder, but not to review the tax documents. Not this time. Instead, he grabbed a pen and started writing. Fast. Focused. The judge moved on to the next case, voice steady and detached, but Kendrick's mind was racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. From the back row, Kendrick watched the courtroom move in its usual rhythm, but he couldn't shake what had just happened. A young woman who came in late now sat casually near the front, scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered. Another man, who'd entered even later, was already at the podium presenting his case. No scolding, no fine. Just business as usual. But for Kendrick, a $750 fine. Harsh. Public. Unjustified. This wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. One Kendrick knew how to spot and how to challenge. He scanned the room with a prosecutor's eye. The fine itself was excessive for a simple delay, especially in a municipal court. He saw it in the faces around him too, people whispering, raising eyebrows, avoiding eye contact. Some were confused. Some were clearly uncomfortable. But none of them said a word. Then, his name echoed again. Kendrick stood. Calm. Collected. Each step to the podium deliberate. The judge looked up, same cold stare, same challenge in his eyes. Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice measured but firm, I'm here to contest the property tax adjustment on my grandmother's home. The property's been in my family for decades, and these new numbers don't match the city's past assessments. He opened the folder, pointing to highlighted sections and photographs. Here's the original assessment, consistent for 5 years. But now, without any notice, there's a 30% increase. No explanation. No justification. Judge Whitman leaned back, almost bored. I'll review it in due time, Mr. Robinson. But your tardiness remains the greater issue here. You really think federal responsibilities excuse disrespecting this court? Kendrick kept his voice even. Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. I was handling a federal human trafficking case this morning. I believe that's something we all agree warrants immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed. Your priorities, however noble, don't excuse breaking rules. This court has procedures for a reason. But it wasn't the words that hit Kendrick, it was the tone. Dismissive. Final. As if none of it mattered. Not his record. Not his intent. Not even the truth. He took a breath. Your Honor, I understand rules. But I have to ask, are those rules being applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple passed through the room. Eyes widened. The judge froze, his face coloring. Are you questioning this court's integrity, Mr. Robinson? I'm asking for clarity, Kendrick replied calmly. Fairness isn't about who's speaking. It's about how the rules are applied, to everyone. The judge's gavel slammed down. I will not tolerate accusations. Your fine stands. Kendrick gave a slight nod, unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, the weight of the moment settling around him. Some eyes watched with quiet respect. Others with fear. But Kendrick had seen this kind of power play before. Still, this time felt different. He slipped out his phone, typing quietly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the court session moved forward, the atmosphere had changed. People noticed. An older black man in the front turned slightly and gave Kendrick a quiet look, one of understanding. The court clerk, once fluid in her motions, now hesitated, visibly unsettled. And in the back corner, a young law student scribbled rapidly in her notebook, eyes wide, jaw set. Inspired. Kendrick didn't need applause. He didn't come for drama. But what just happened wouldn't disappear into silence. It had already planted something. Kendrick stepped out of the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, but his mind was no longer on property taxes or even the fine. Something bigger had just unfolded, and he felt it in every step he took. This wasn't about a single moment of disrespect. This was about a system. And Kendrick Robinson had seen enough to know when a pattern demanded action. The crisp air outside did little to cool the fire building inside him. People moved in and out of the courthouse like any other day, but Kendrick stood still on the steps, lost in thought. He looked down at his phone. His thumb hovered over the contact for his assistant back at the U.S. Attorney's office. No. Not yet, he muttered, lowering the phone. Instead, he pulled out his notebook again, reviewing everything, each interaction, each inconsistency, each unspoken message. The disparity wasn't random. It wasn't a fluke. It was built in. And Kendrick's instincts told him exactly what it was, structural bias. Back in his car, he opened his briefcase and took out his credentials. The gold-embossed badge of the Department of Justice glinted in the morning sun. Kendrick didn't just feel the need to respond, he knew what had to be done. He made a decision. And then, he walked back in. By now, most of the morning cases had wrapped up. The room was quieter, just a few people still waiting their turn or shuffling through papers. Judge Whitman sat at the bench, thumbing through documents, the fatigue of the day showing in his face. Kendrick walked directly toward the podium, this time, not just as a citizen disputing taxes, but as a federal officer of the court. His badge and identification were clearly visible in his hand. The court clerk froze, her fingers still mid-type. Judge Whitman glanced up, and his irritation returned immediately. "Mr. Robinson, this session is concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to make an appointment." "With respect, Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He raised his badge slightly so everyone in the room could see it. "My name is Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've spent over 10 years with the Department of Justice handling cases involving human trafficking, public corruption, and civil rights violations." The room shifted. The judge froze. You could feel the silence settle like fog. "I was late this morning due to an urgent federal matter requiring immediate attention," Kendrick continued, eyes steady on the judge. "And while I fully understand the importance of punctuality and court procedures, what I witnessed here today, how cases were handled, who was reprimanded and who was not, raises serious concerns." Judge Whitman's jaw tightened. "Mr. Robinson, if you believe there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint." Kendrick held up his notebook. "I've already begun. Not just regarding my own treatment, but the differential response to other late arrivals, especially when viewed through the lens of race. As an officer of this court, I have a duty to report any signs of bias or unequal treatment." The judge leaned back, visibly unsettled. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct?" "I'm stating what I observed," Kendrick said evenly. "And I'm standing by it. I've spent my career making sure justice is applied equally, regardless of who's standing before the bench. What happened here today contradicts that principle." The air in the room was thick with tension. The court clerk glanced nervously between them, unsure whether to keep typing. The young law student in the back didn't look away for a second, her pen scribbling furiously, her face lit with disbelief and something else, inspiration. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you feel there was a lapse in judgment, I recommend addressing it through the proper channels." "I intend to," Kendrick replied, placing his badge gently on the podium. "But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection. For asking whether fairness is truly being upheld in this courtroom for everyone." Judge Whitman gripped the arms of his chair, visibly shaken. For decades, his authority had gone unchallenged. But now, something was cracking. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said quietly. Kendrick gathered his badge, offered a final respectful nod, and turned to leave. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll make sure this is addressed thoroughly." As he walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt every eye in the room follow him. The silence behind him wasn't empty, it was full of thought, recognition, and something that couldn't be undone. Because this wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone. This was no longer about one courtroom or one judge. It was about a system, one that had gone unchecked for too long, blind to its own flaws. As Kendrick stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he didn't pause to reflect. He pulled out his phone and started typing. Every observation, every interaction, every moment of disparity he'd witnessed was laid out in detail. By the time he hit send, the email wasn't just a report, it was a spark. And Kendrick knew it was only the beginning. What he didn't expect was how fast that spark would catch fire. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Julia Harper. She was a veteran attorney, no stranger to high-stakes cases, and her voice carried both urgency and something else, respect. "Kendrick," she said, "I read your report. If what you've written is accurate, we're not dealing with a one-off situation. This could be systemic bias." "I believe it is," Kendrick replied without hesitation. "What happened in that courtroom wasn't subtle. It was part of a pattern. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's seen it." Julia let out a breath. "I'll contact the Judicial Review Commission. We'll need to handle this delicately, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather everything. If this story breaks publicly, we need to be ready." The call ended, but Kendrick's real work was just beginning. For hours, he combed through the public records of Judge Whitman's courtroom, case after case. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Black defendants consistently faced steeper fines for the same minor infractions that white defendants were let off with warnings or minimal fees. He reached out to colleagues, local attorneys, even former defendants. The responses flooded in. Some whispered their stories with fear. Others spoke with defiance. One young black woman described how she was hit with a heavy fine for a single parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses got off easy. Another attorney recalled how the judge frequently cut off black defendants mid-sentence, denying them a full chance to explain themselves. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal inquiry. Investigators began poring over years of records. They interviewed courthouse staff. And soon, the silence that had protected the system began to crack. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, became a key figure. Hands trembling, she opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small, well-worn notebook. "I've been keeping notes," she said quietly. "Every time something felt wrong, I wrote it down. I've been too scared to speak up, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her notes told a chilling story: names, dates, details, documenting years of disparities and unequal treatment. Then came James Wilson, the bailiff. A man of few words, but when he spoke, it mattered. "I've been here 15 years, he said, voice low but steady. "And I've seen it, how people are treated differently based on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right. But I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to slip beyond the courthouse walls. The young law student who had witnessed the original confrontation posted her account online. Within hours, it went viral. The public response was immediate and explosive. Headlines followed. "Bias in Greenville Courtroom. Federal prosecutor challenges local judge. Equal justice or just us?" Social media lit up with hashtags like #EqualJusticeNow and #BiasInTheCourts as thousands shared their own stories of discrimination in courtrooms across the country. Kendrick stayed focused, working with the Review Commission to organize the growing mountain of evidence. The numbers were staggering. Over a 5-year period, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for the same violations. By the end of the first week, Julia Harper called again. "Kendrick, the findings are devastating. The data doesn't lie. We're taking this to the State Judicial Board. And Kendrick, get ready. The media isn't going to let this go." He nodded silently, exhaustion finally settling in, but it didn't stop him. Because this had grown into something far bigger than him. It was about exposing a system that punished in silence. And for the first time, the silence was breaking. In Judge Whitman's courtroom, the pattern had been hiding in plain sight. White defendants who arrived late were often overlooked. No scolding. No fines. But when it came to black defendants, the reprimands were swift, the penalties steep. Even basic requests, like payment plans or court extensions, were far more likely to be denied. The disparity wasn't just on paper. It was lived. It was personal. And when Kendrick's story became public, others found the courage to speak. A black mother came forward. She had been fined $500 for challenging a minor zoning error, despite showing evidence that the city, not she, was at fault. A young man described how Judge Whitman publicly questioned his work ethic, ridiculing him in open court. Minutes later, a white defendant with the same case walked away without a word of judgment. The evidence kept piling up, and so did the voices. Local activist groups mobilized quickly, organizing protests outside the courthouse. Signs read "Justice should be blind" and "End bias now." The crowds grew by the day. But Kendrick stayed away from the spotlight. He had no interest in becoming a symbol. He was focused on the work unfolding inside the courthouse. And that work was changing everything. Court staff who had stayed silent for years began stepping forward. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk who had quietly documented years of troubling behavior, became a key voice in the investigation. Her notebook, combined with official court records, painted a detailed portrait of deep, systemic bias. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during one interview. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even James Wilson, the veteran bailiff, went public. "I've seen this for years," he said, "and I always knew it wasn't right. But now, it's time." Judge Whitman, once untouchable, found himself increasingly cornered. He tried to dismiss the accusations at first, brushing them off as misinterpretations. But the mountain of evidence, and the voices rising against him, left no room for denial. In a rare public statement, he offered a vague apology, expressing regret for any unintentional harm. But by then, the damage was done. Kendrick, though swamped with attention, stayed grounded. His phone rang constantly. Emails poured in. Letters arrived from across the country. Some offered support. Others shared painful stories of courtroom bias they'd buried for years. One letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "I saw these same injustices for years, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage so many of us didn't." The movement had outgrown Greenville. Reporters began digging into court records across the state. Other judges came under scrutiny. The South Carolina Judicial Oversight Committee launched a statewide review of municipal courts, promising sweeping reforms. And then came the report. The Judicial Review Commission's findings were damning. The data told the brutal truth: black defendants in Judge Whitman's courtroom were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the exact same offenses. The report didn't stop there. It called for mandatory anti-bias training for all judges, independent oversight boards, regular audits of courtroom decisions, structural change, not just symbolic gestures. Under growing pressure and facing the threat of disciplinary hearings, Judge Whitman finally stepped down. In a short, carefully worded statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interest of the court and this community that I step aside." Some saw it as an admission of guilt. Others saw it as a necessary step forward. For Kendrick, it wasn't celebration. It was confirmation. A step in the right direction. But only a step. The resignation marked the end of an era, but not the end of the fight. As reforms rolled out, Kendrick found himself in a new role. Law schools, community forums, legal conferences, he was invited everywhere to speak about what had happened and why it mattered. His story inspired a new generation of lawyers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. At one event, a young black law student approached him after his speech. "You showed me that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You gave me a reason to believe again." Kendrick smiled. "The fight's just beginning. But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that set it all in motion, the courthouse in Greenville looked and felt completely different. The beige walls had been repainted. A new welcome desk greeted visitors at the door. Signs in multiple languages guided people to free resources, legal aid, payment plans, step-by-step guides. Near the entrance, a small but powerful plaque had been installed. It read, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside the courtroom, the silence felt different now. Not fearful. Not weighted with inequality. Judge Whitman was no longer presiding. The room had changed. And Kendrick knew it was only the beginning. After quietly stepping down from the bench, Judge Whitman was replaced by someone new, a younger judge known for fairness, humility, and an unshakable commitment to justice. But the most important changes weren't about who sat at the bench. They were about the system itself. Mandatory bias training was now in place for all court personnel, led by experts who focused not just on overt discrimination, but on the subtle, often invisible ways bias shaped outcomes. Real change had begun. Kendrick stood quietly at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, scanning the space that had once carried so much tension. He had been invited to speak to a room full of local judges and attorneys about what had changed and what still needed to. He felt a mix of pride and cautious optimism. The work was far from finished, but progress was real. What started in Greenville had spread across South Carolina and beyond. Other communities, inspired by Kendrick's courage, began auditing their own court systems. Judicial review boards implemented mandatory case audits with a sharp focus on racial and economic disparities. Oversight committees were created, composed not just of legal experts, but of former defendants, activists, and community leaders. At Kendrick's office, the momentum was impossible to ignore. On the wall behind his desk hung the citation he'd received that fateful morning, the $750 fine. Framed. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Below it, a photo from a recent event, a group of law students who had founded a civil rights legal clinic in his honor. Their smile said everything. He felt their hope. And he felt the responsibility that came with it. In the community, the ripple effects grew even deeper. James Wilson, the former bailiff, was now leading training sessions for court officers. At one session, he stood before a group of new hires and said, "Our job isn't just to keep order. It's to protect dignity. If you see something wrong, speak up. Because silence is complicity." And Mrs. Thompson, the clerk whose records had cracked the case wide open, had been promoted to lead a new ethical practices program for court administration. She mentored young clerks now, making sure the lessons of the past would never be forgotten. Kendrick's impact didn't stop at the courthouse. He began teaching a course at a nearby law school on civil rights and ethics in the judiciary. His students often stayed late, asking how they could help fix what was broken. One afternoon, a student approached him, notebook in hand. "What's the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick paused before answering. "Listen," he said, "to the people who pass through these courtrooms, and to the ones too afraid to speak. Change begins when we truly listen." Of course, not everyone embraced the new oversight. Some judges, some attorneys, pushed back, claiming the reforms threatened their independence. But the numbers spoke louder than the resistance. Within 1 year, racial disparities in fines and sentencing dropped significantly in Greenville. Payment plans were approved more often. Defendants reported being treated with greater respect. And slowly, trust began to return. But for Kendrick, the most meaningful moments didn't come from reports or headlines. They came from the people. An elderly black man returned to the courthouse months after that pivotal day. He approached Kendrick and said, voice heavy with emotion, "I've been coming here for 40 years. I've seen injustice you wouldn't believe. But I never thought I'd see someone finally say, enough. Thank you for giving us hope." And one morning, Kendrick received a letter. It was from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his case and been inspired to launch her own investigation into court bias. She ended the letter with one simple line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read it twice, then filed it under a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back in his chair and let the silence speak for itself. Because he knew it was never about him. It was about the countless voices that had been overlooked for too long. Voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick returned once more to the courthouse where everything had started. This time, not as a litigator, not as an investigator, but as a guest speaker, invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center named in part in recognition of his work. As he stepped to the podium, the courtroom was packed. Judges, clerks, lawyers, activists, law students, community members, all watching, all listening. Kendrick looked out at them and said, "Justice isn't just about laws on paper. It's about how we treat people. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about making sure that everyone, no matter where they come from or what they look like, knows that they matter." The applause was overwhelming. But Kendrick didn't hear the noise. He was focused on the faces, the hope in their eyes, the determination in their posture. And in that moment, he knew. The fight wasn't over, but it was headed in the right direction.